Well, hello. Welcome one more time to our online Bible study. We're working our way through some of the backstories temporarily through 1 Samuel. We've been on Sunday mornings, if you're following us at Cornerstone, we've been doing a series on 2 Samuel, which is the story of David becoming king of Israel and the blessing of God and a man after God's own heart. Well, there's several stories leading up to that that are really, really interesting. And so we've been doing some of the backstories which are found in 1 Samuel. And talking some about David, talking some about Saul, why he was replaced, and that's an interesting story in and of itself. And so we've covered that. We've covered some of the things that have led up to this point today, and these have not been really in order, but really in kind of the way that they've been tying together with our Sunday morning. So if you see something on Sunday morning, then I look for some of the backstories that went along with that. And so when we were talking about the Lord's anointed at the beginning of 2 Samuel, we were talking about the anointing of Saul and the anointing of David, etc. So, but in some ways, the whole setup to the story that we're in with David and becoming king and the blessing of Israel has its roots in a couple of generations before that. Why did they establish a king in King Saul? And then that David inherited that kingdom when Saul fell out of favor with God. So I want us to go through a little bit today, a couple of stories. In fact, it's kind of a theme running through from chapter 1 through around chapter 8. And we're certainly not going to cover all those chapters, but we're going to cover one theme and see how that relates to our study. And so what we see in the books called 1 and 2 Samuel is in some way they're about Samuel and his legacy. And the story of Samuel begins with his dad Elkanah and his mom Hannah. His dad had two wives. Hannah was only one of them. And what we see is that Hannah really pleaded with God. You remember they'd go to the temple and she'd go to the temple, not temple built per se, but to the place of the Lord, to the tabernacle place. And what they would do is, as they went up to make their offerings and sacrifices, she would plead to the point where Eli, we get introduced in the first chapter to Eli, kind of says, "Oh, you've had a lot of strong drink. You need to go away." And she said, "No, this is what I want. I'm troubled. I don't have a child." And we know Elkanah's other wife would pick on her because of that. And so she prayed. Eli finally answered, "Go in peace. The God of Israel grant your petition that you've made to him." And so when that happened and she bore Samuel after she'd weaned him, she took him to the temple and said, "This is God's child." And she gave him to God. And so what Eli, I think, did was go in and say, "Hey, I hope that you get to have a lot of other children in addition." And I think she had 3 more sons and two daughters, but Samuel grew up as he was given to God. And so we have that prayer, and we have some things going on in 1 Samuel chapter 2. And what happens is they go back, and Samuel has stayed, and we begin to learn more about Eli. And the story at the end of chapter 2 is about Eli's worthless children. So Eli has a chance to raise really 3 gentlemen in the presence of God, being a priest. And we see his own 2 kids, Phinehas and Hophni, don't following God. It says at one point they don't know God. And we see then Samuel becoming more important because God talks to Samuel and he says, "Hey, here I am." But this is the story that relates to Eli's 2 children. And so it says that they were worthless men. They did not know the Lord. This is chapter 2, verse 12. And this is one of the stories that points it out. So the custom of the priest, when the people are offering a sacrifice to God, the priest would come while the meat was boiling and take a fork, and the version that I have says specifically a 3-pronged fork, and they would thrust it into the pan or kettle and pull it up. Whatever they took out was their portion, and they would eat that, and the rest of the people would have the rest of it. Now, if you're greedy, what do you want? You want more than a forkful. Now, a forkful might be a large chunk of meat, but it wouldn't be everything in the pot. And so what Eli's kids would do is that they would come in and they would say, well, we're going to stick our fork in it when it's raw. Well, when you do that, and they say, hey, wait till it cooks a little and the fat burns down, because when the fat starts to tear apart, and it melts down and you get that wonderful meat with the fat boiled in and all that, when it's all rendered down, it breaks apart into pieces. So you think about a roast, and you stick your fork in and you get out a little versus sticking your fork in a hole and you'd pull the whole thing up. And so people said to them, hey, let them burn the fat first, then take what you want. And they'd say, no, give us it now or we'll take it by force. And so the young men were, the sin of the young men was very great in the sight of the Lord, for they treated the offering of the Lord with contempt. That's chapter 2, verse 17. And so it wasn't that they were greedy in taking. It was that this was the sacrifice of God. This was a sacrifice to God. This is something holy, and the two people treated it as not holy. The two people treated it as somehow to get rich. And it was disappointing. And so in the middle of that story, it tells us that Samuel was ministering to the Lord. He wore the linen ephod, which is the key of the priest, and so his mother every year would bring him a little robe, and at some point she asked for more children. And so this is the point where Eli says, may the Lord bless you and give you more. And it says she had 3 sons and daughters. And then in the next section, so it's hard to ignore what the writer here is doing. And God, who inspired it, he's trying to showcase side by side. We get a showcase of David and Saul. We get a showcase of Eli and Saul, really, but Samuel coming into this area, and then the 2 sons of Eli, and so they don't come out looking too good. And Eli's getting old. He kept hearing everything his sons were doing to all of Israel, so they're robbing them. They did a lot. It says they do a lot, but he starts talking about some of the things that they're doing. And in verse 24, he said, no, my sons, it's no good report that I hear the people of the Lord spreading about you abroad. And here's what he says about their sin, because they're desecrating, they're doing something unholy. They're desecrating the offering and treating it with ill respect. He says, if someone sins against man, okay, if you were robbing from a human being, then God could intercede for you and forgive you. But what if you're robbing from God? If you're robbing from God, what then? He says, if someone sins against the Lord, who is then left to intercede? God's not the intercessor at that point. God's the prosecutor and the judge. And so who would become the defense attorney for these 2 men? And what Eli is saying is, hey, you've put yourself in a bad position. But they wouldn't listen to the voice of their father. It says very specifically the voice. And at some point later, when Eli falls out of the grace of God because he won't restrict, or restrain is the word used, he won't restrain his sons. In other words, he knows they're cheating and he tells them not to. He knows they're stealing from God. He tells them not to, but he doesn't remove them from their position where they do that. If you're going to say things but not act in accordance with that, God's not too friendly with that. So in essence, because Eli is allowing them to remain in that position where they're doing such things, God is going to hold Eli responsible, and the 2 sons too, but he holds up their household, and he tells them that. The end of chapter 2, we haven't even gotten through chapter 2. The great story about Samuel coming into the temple and all these things, and then, or to the house of the Lord. I keep saying temple, and there's not technically a temple until Solomon, in that way that we think about it. But he says, okay, I'm gonna replace you, and Hophni and Phinehas. This will be a sign. In verse 34, both of them will die on the same day, and I'll raise up for myself a faithful priest who'll do according to what's in my heart and in my mind, and I will build him a sure house, and he will go in and out before me, anointed forever. So anointed means he's going to pick somebody. And so, there it is. And so that the next scenario is then the story of Samuel being chosen. And so Samuel's ministering to the Lord. And it says in chapter 3, we're finally in chapter 3 of 1 Samuel, the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision. Why not? Well, Eli was running things, prioritizing keeping his children in charge rather than keeping people who were holy. Well, that's that's something he'll pay for. And so his eyesight began to grow dim, and it says the lamp of God had not yet gone out, which is a fantastic analogy. There was a lamp burning in that place, and so Samuel was running down anyway, but it said that the light was still, there's still a flickering of light. Okay, and that's what we're hoping for. Things are going to get worse in just a minute because of Eli not following God, and Eli not making sure that the people who were in his place were following God. So anyway, we have the calling of Samuel, come here. And so finally Samuel says, speak, for your servant hears. And what he said is, I've replaced Eli. Well, he already told Eli that. But at the end of the story, we see Eli coming out and saying, okay, did God speak to you, Samuel? He said, yeah. He said, don't hold it back from me. Tell me what God said. It's sad for the priest to come up to somebody and say, tell me what God said about me. But he knew already. And the next story, it's interesting because you have to pay attention to the stories that are before and after to get all the full symbolic measure, I believe, of this story, is that the Philistines come in and they capture the Ark, which is the Ark of the Covenant, which is the symbol of the presence of God. And so even though the lamp of the Lord has not gone out, what we see is it's dim. And what we see is the full presence of God is not with Israel, even though he's already made a set transition of power to Samuel. It's not yet happened. And so, there's some issue there that Israel's going to have to go through, and the Philistines play part in that. Incidentally, there's a long history in the Old Testament of God using people who were not in favor of God to accomplish God's purposes. And you could think of people like Nebuchadnezzar. You could think of all of Babylon and Persia. You can think about the stories of Esther. You can think about the bad kings who wrought havoc. And this is certainly a story. And so they're encamped at Ebenezer, and that's important to the story. The song that we read, Here I Raise Mine Ebenezers, is a part of this story. But the Israelites fled. The Philistines rose up. Hophni and Phinehas were part of the battle, and they were killed and died on that day. And so then we see they came, and of course that's what God had said, both your children are going to die on the same day. And when somebody came up to tell Eli, he was sitting, in a particular place by the road watching, and he said his heart trembled for the Ark of God because they'd taken the Ark of God to go down and bless them, and the Ark ended up getting captured. He said, what is this uproar? And the man had to talk to him in a way that he was blind, but he said Eli was 98 years old, and his eyes were said he could not see. Again, perhaps an analogy. Physically is what it's saying, he couldn't see, but the reason they're in this problem is because spiritually he got to a place where he couldn't see. The guy said, I'm the one who came from battle and I fled today. And he said, well, how did it go? So he brought the news. Israel fled the Philistines. There was a great defeat. Your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the Ark of the Covenant was captured. And so the ultimate message from God was that the light has departed from this place. The lamp has gone out for you. And it said when he saw that, he fell backward in his seat by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died. And it said, for he was old and heavy, and he had judged Israel for 40 years. There's an interesting story about Ichabod. If you want to read that, read the rest of chapter 4 there, about being named, and basically the glory has departed from Israel. Now, the Philistines didn't know what they had. They thought they had this magic kind of formula where if we hold the magic box, nobody else can defeat us. But it wasn't a magic box. It was the presence of the Lord Almighty. So they put him next to their god, Dagon, and increasingly they kept going in, and Dagon would be falling on his face, Dagon being their idol. And so it kind of wreaks havoc. Chapter 5 is an interesting thing about how God would move. Finally, what they said is, let's get rid of the Ark of God. And so I believe they hooked it up to a couple of cows and set it on a cart and moved out from there. And so the Ark was returned after 7 months from the Philistines, not returned all the way up into Israel, into what we would see as Jerusalem. David did that, you remember. But they got it to a certain point where it was in Israel again, and they kind of got somebody to keep it in a certain place and go that far. But it's not long after that In the ark is back at Kiriath Jearim. Samuel is the judge. And what Samuel did in that area in Ebenezer is he raised a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Shen, called its name Ebenezer. It means stone of help. And this is what he said: until now the Lord has helped us. Okay, so thus far the Lord has helped us. He's brought us to this place. It's not a full place of the blessing and presence of God. We see that really come back with David, not even with Saul. And for Samuel to be in that place where, Eli was responsible for the ark being gone, Samuel's in place for the ark being brought back. And they have a victory, and he says, gather all of Israel, and they're going to make their offerings, and they do that, and they put the stone as part of the song, Here I Raise My Ebenezer. And it's really that God has brought us to this far. And if God has brought us this far, I'll continue. But the story, of course, unfortunately falls flat. And so kind of with chapter 8, we see two bookends. We started off with, Samuel's going to be great for a while, and Eli's not great, but God has already kind of provided Samuel from chapter 1, and the book is about Samuel. So even though Eli's kind of set up to fall down in this place, and we already have a victor, Saul, in that way, in many ways is the same way. We have Saul, we know he's not the chosen one of God, but God has already picked David. There's really sort of a salvation history there. We know throughout the whole Testament that we're not going to be where we need to be, that salvation for us is incomplete, but we already have Jesus as the undercarrier who's already been chosen. And we talked about Sunday how in the blessing of God to David said to God, I want to build your house. And God said to David, well, that's great. What I'm going to do is I'm going to build you a house. And that's going to include one being born of you that will establish your kingdom in front of me forever. And so we really see some kind of hints at that at the kingdom of Jesus being King of Kings, the son of Jesse, son of David. But here's what happens at the end of that. We see kind of the salvation of Israel to that point with Samuel. And in the Bible, we were seeing the Samuel, but in chapter 7, it gives us a snippet about the end of Samuel. It's telling us the story towards the middle of chapter 7. It's going to start again in chapter 8 and keep going, but there's just a few verses, 15, 16, 17, and chapter 7 that give us an indication of what's coming. Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life, and he went on a circuit year by year to Bethel, Gilgal, Mizpah, and he judged Israel in all those places, and then he would return to Ramah, for his home was there, and there he also judged. So he was pretty smart. He built an altar. He'd go around, he judged. Now the priest in this position would have judged Israel, set up as a judge to lead, to be the intermediary. But what happens is you consolidate all this power where sometimes the priest is also the prophet, and also the judge would be the prince or the leader, the king at the time. And what we see developing in many ways is a difference between prophet, priest, and king coming apart at this range, and there's a reason we do. In chapter 8, this little snippet, chapter 8, verse 1, when Samuel became old, now he's going to continue the story. Story's not over. He made his sons judges over Israel. Did it say he made them priest? He's a priest. His son ought to be priest. They're not priests. He makes them judges. The name of the firstborn Joel and the name of the second Abijah, they were judges in Beersheba, and yet look what it says in verse 3. In verse 3 of chapter 8, we see something that's really pitiful. And we see the theme of chapter 2, where Eli's sons were wicked, continue with Samuel, even though Eli raised Hophni and Phinehas and Samuel. Samuel becomes the priest, next priest, and judges Israel in that way. Here what we see in verse 3 is, yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. And they took bribes and perverted justice. And so you say, well, why do we have King David? Why did we have King Saul? Chapter 8, verse 4, then the elders, it's because of his sons, the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, behold, you're old and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the other nations. And so from that point on, we see a person picked as king. God is willing to bless him with that, even though he wanted the judges to do it. One of the big problems with the judges is, especially Eli, he did pretty well, except he didn't rein in his kids. Well, surely Samuel learned from that, right? Surely Samuel, if his sons don't follow in his footsteps, he would learn that lesson, right? And yet what appears to us is he did not. I learned that lesson because he made his own sons judges over Israel, and they did not judge well. Okay, so what's the dilemma here that we see Eli, who hears from God and is a prophet, priest, he's the great judge, okay? And yet his sons don't follow, and yet he leaves his sons in the place that they are. And then we see the situation repeat with Samuel. What's the situation here? It's so hard for a human being to put God first above family in that sense. To not think of your sons in an accurate way, to think of them being the people who have all the same experiences you do in being raised in the presence of God, and yet they respond differently. And so I think there's a big barrier in our heart and in our mind from taking action against our own kids to protect Israel, and it didn't happen. And so we see that the downfall of Eli was the downfall of Samuel. And it's one that continues. And so God often replaces a family because the children aren't always the way the fathers and mothers are. And it's sad. I'm not sure I have the answer to that. I'm not sure I understand the full meaning of that passage. But I think one of the most important things for us to do as parents is to try to raise our own children to follow, to try to raise them up. But often when you make sacrifices for God, other people around you who have to bear the sacrifice from the decision you make. Okay, if you make a decision, we're gonna do this. Other people, your family bears the brunt of that. If you say, I'm going to the mission field, I'm going into the pastorate, I'm going to do this, your family gets pulled into that. And in many ways, we see families that resent that, aren't in favor of that, pay the price of that without having been able to make the decision themselves. The decision's made for them. I'm not trying to read too much into this. I'm not trying to be bitter. I'm not trying to do any of those things, but just to say, the human condition is what it is. And what we see, both the children of Eli and the children of Samuel, is that greed became a factor. What can we get out of this? And for Eli is even to steal from God or steal the sacrifice offering of God. And from the others to pervert justice. We see two of the innate features of God to be holy. The first two desecrated the holiness of God. And then on the second end, is justice and truth. And they certainly did not do that. And they did it because of greed. Greed can get in. And what we see is power. Okay, when you have power over somebody, there's a couple of different ways to see that. Power can be the servant, or power can be the Lord and the master who wants to be fed. Jesus, the epitome of this is Jesus saying, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. And what we see in King David is that God tasked him with being the shepherd over Israel. So the shepherd is not one where the sheep come in and give him gifts all the time and make him feel good about his ego. The shepherd is the one who takes the power that they have over the sheep but uses it for the betterment of the sheep. And so we understand the Bible teaches us very well about power, about money, about greed, about sin, about the human condition. All of these things are part of our Bible in which we read. And God ultimately says, Jesus says that you can't serve God and man, you can't serve God and money, you can't serve God and blah, 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 blah. But it's very tempting to be greedy. And so what do we see? The rich young ruler comes up to Jesus and says, what do I need to do? And he says, well, follow all of these things and you'll be fine. And the guy said, I did, but Jesus knows that his heart is not for God. Jesus knows that his heart is wrapped up around the things that he has. So he says to him, very wisely, okay, well then go give away everything you have to the poor and follow me. And that's where the man walks away. So where's our heart? David was a man after God's own heart. And as we continue through this study, reading about kind of the undercurrents that are going on, reading about the things that David does, we realize that if we have any power, it's to help people. If we want to serve God, it's self-sacrifice. And one of the key things about self-sacrifice is when our family sacrifices too, we really need to be good disciplers of our children and grandchildren. And we really need to try to grab and raise a family very well. And so I would say if there's a task, I mean, if you look at, Samuel, it says he would rotate year, quarter by quarter kind of around is the way I would read it. Year by year, Bethel, Gilgal, Mizpah, and then be back home. Maybe he was absent. Maybe, I know there's a lot of people who, for the sake of God, would leave Billy Graham once said, the one thing I regret about my ministry is I traveled so much, I didn't have as much time with my own children. I'm not saying don't be Billy Graham, don't travel, and don't be a part of the ministry of God, but I'm saying, be a part of honoring your own family, and don't leave them behind in that, and make sure they come with you, because it's certainly a theme throughout all of this. Well, I hope that you're doing well, and I hope that you're enjoying all of this. If you want to go back and reread some of these passages, I hope that when we hear a story from God and we read it, we're like, oh, wait, and it drives us more to Scripture. What I never want to do is be instead of Scripture. I don't want to read it so that you don't have to read it. I want to hopefully pique your interest, and as we go through, sometimes I'll say, oh, there's something, hey, go back and read about Ichabod, and then you'll be so curious, what is Ichabod? I know Ichabod. What about Ichabod? We're going to go back and reread it. What about Ebenezer, when the song says, here I raise mine Ebenezer? That popular hymn. What does that mean? And so we'll go back and kind of read so far the Lord has taken us. And let's end with that. So if the Lord has brought us this far, we have full hope that He'll continue to take us forward. So my blessings with you, and I hope that you have a great week.